You know what's funny about house hunting? Everyone acts like it's this romantic milestone. Like suddenly, you're playing grown up and everything's supposed to fall into place. I'm Vera. I'm 28. And I used to think having a boyfriend with his shit together was the jackpot. 6 years with Caleb. Met him when we were both 22 at some friend's gathering where I was wearing this denim jacket covered in band patches. Thinking I was so edgy and cool, he was opening his beer wrong. Like, really wrong. And I couldn't help but tease him about it. That teasing turned into flirting. Flirting turned into 6 years of my life that I'll never get back. Caleb worked in some tech job where people only bothered him when their computers were basically on fire. I was in human resources, running meetings, like I owned the whole damn company. We were good together at first, or at least I thought we were. After 3 years of dating, we moved in together because it made financial sense. Split everything right down the middle, like we were business partners instead of lovers. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too caught up in playing house to notice. Here's the thing about Caleb. He'd been living with his parents before me, saving every single penny like some kind of financial robot. His main goal in life was to save enough money for a house with a huge down payment. Meanwhile, I'm trying to actually live my 20s instead of planning for some fantasy future that might never happen. Over time, our savings account started looking really different, and I could tell it bothered him even though we were splitting expenses equally. Our salaries were pretty similar, but apparently I was irresponsible with money because I didn't want to eat ramen every night to save an extra $50. The weird part was how he never asked me to pay more of the bills, even though he clearly thought I should. In his head, he was saving money for his future wife, and he was 90% sure that was going to be me. But until we were actually engaged or married, he was going to be careful with his precious money. I should have seen how calculating that was, but I was just relieved I didn't have to stretch my budget even thinner. When he finally had enough saved for a house, he expected me to be thrilled. I had maybe a couple thousand in savings, enough for a vacation, not a down payment. He said I could contribute in other ways, like cooking and groceries and furniture shopping. How generous of him. Right. I should have insisted on contributing money to the down payment. Should have demanded to be on the deed. But honestly, less paperwork for me. I actually laughed when he said that, thinking he was being considerate. God, I was so naive. We spent 3 months looking at houses. And let me tell you, house hunting with Caleb was about as exciting as watching paint dry. He had spreadsheets comparing mortgage rates and property taxes. He'd measure rooms with this little tape measure he carried around like some kind of contractor. Finally, we found this 3-bedroom place with a finished garage and a brand new kitchen. It was the perfect combination of boring and functional. Exactly what Caleb wanted. Everything went under his name, mortgage, title insurance, utilities, even the fucking mailbox. I didn't think much of it at the time because we were splitting the monthly expenses anyway. But looking back, that was the beginning of the end. I was living in Caleb's house, playing by Caleb's rules, while he got to be the generous boyfriend, letting his girlfriend contribute to groceries and decorative pillows. At first, I tried to make it feel like our place. I hosted wine nights for my coworkers, tried to start this cute little herb garden in the back corner of the yard. Caleb set up his home gym in that finished garage and suddenly had all this energy from working out at dawn every day. He was sleeping better, eating better, basically becoming this optimized version of himself, while I felt trapped in suburbia. That's when I started realizing how different we really were. He was ready to settle down and be boring married people, and I was still trying to figure out who I was supposed to be. All my friends were going out, having adventures, posting about their amazing nights while I was home watching Netflix with Mr. Routine. So I started going out again. Friday happy hours, Sunday brunches, Wednesday trivia nights with my coworker Megan, who actually knew how to have fun. Caleb would give me these passive-aggressive looks when I'd get ready to go out, like I was abandoning him or betraying our relationship somehow. Then he'd get all cold and distant when I'd come home happy and energized from actually socializing with people my own age. He started asking me detailed questions about where I'd been and who I'd talked to, like he was entitled to a complete report of my social life. That's when I got the privacy screen for my phone. It wasn't about hiding anything. It was about having some basic privacy from his constant monitoring. But of course, he noticed and made comments about how I never used to need privacy. Maybe because I never used to have a boyfriend who acted like my parole officer. The final straw was when he accused me of being cold and distant. Like, excuse me, I was trying to maintain some independence while living in his house under his rules with his name on everything that mattered. When I pointed out that he'd been emotionally unavailable and controlling, he flipped it around and said I was the one pulling away. Classic manipulation. Make the other person feel guilty for having boundaries. I realized we were in completely different stages of life. And frankly, his stage looked boring as hell. He was ready to grow up and be responsible, and I was trying to hold on to my youth before it disappeared completely. But that didn't mean I was going to let him guilt me into becoming his suburban housewife fantasy when I wasn't even his wife. The whole dynamic was suffocating. Here I was, a 26-year-old woman with my own career and my own life, being made to feel guilty for wanting to go out with friends or have some privacy on my phone. Meanwhile, Caleb got to play the role of the responsible homeowner while treating me like some kind of tenant with benefits. It was his house, his rules, his timeline, and I was just along for the ride. Looking back, I can see that we wanted completely different things. He wanted a wife who would be grateful for his financial planning and thrilled to play house in his perfectly boring suburban life. I wanted a partner who would grow with me, not someone who expected me to shrink into his predetermined mold. But instead of having an honest conversation about our differences, we just grew more and more resentful of each other until something had to give. What I didn't realize at the time was that Caleb had already decided I wasn't wife material. All that talk about saving money for his future wife. He'd already figured out I wasn't her. He was just going through the motions, waiting for the right moment to prove he'd been right about me all along. And I was about to give him exactly the ammunition he needed. The thing is, when you feel emotionally starved in a relationship, when your partner makes you feel like an inconvenience instead of a priority, you start looking for that connection elsewhere. It's not planned. It's not calculated. It's just human nature. And Caleb's cold, controlling behavior was pushing me toward exactly the kind of situation he probably expected me to end up in. Maybe he even wanted me to mess up so he could be the victim and I could be the bad guy. Maybe this whole thing was just an elaborate test that he'd set up for me to fail. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, we were just two people living together who wanted completely different things out of life. Too stubborn and proud to admit that maybe we weren't right for each other after all. That's when Megan introduced me to her friends from the local music scene. They were all young, creative, full of energy and passion for life. Being around them reminded me of who I used to be before I got caught up in Caleb's boring suburban dream. And one of them in particular caught my attention. This guy Dante, who played guitar and actually knew how to make me laugh without analyzing everything to death. It started innocently enough. Group hangouts, casual conversations, the kind of flirting that happens when you remember what it feels like to be desired instead of just tolerated. Dante was 23, still figuring out his life, playing in this indie band that was actually pretty talented. When he looked at me, I could see myself through his eyes, not as Caleb's disappointing girlfriend who couldn't appreciate his financial planning, but as this interesting, attractive woman who was worth paying attention to. The texting started in group chats about where everyone was meeting up, but gradually became more personal. And honestly, it felt incredible to have someone actually interested in what I had to say. Caleb would just grunt and nod when I tried to share work stories or friend drama, but Dante actually listened. He asked questions, made me feel heard in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I wasn't trying to cheat or hurt anyone. I was just trying to feel alive again, to remember who I was before I became this version of myself that Caleb clearly didn't appreciate anyway. When the opportunity presented itself, when Caleb announced he had to go to some tech conference out of town, it felt like the universe giving me permission to figure out what I actually wanted. I kissed him goodbye that morning, told him to have fun, meant it genuinely. I wasn't plotting or scheming. I just saw it as a chance to spend some time with people who actually enjoyed my company instead of treating me like some kind of burden they had to manage. When Dante came over that evening, it felt natural. We ordered takeout, watched Netflix, talked about music and life and all the things Caleb never wanted to discuss. When he kicked off his shoes and put his feet up on Caleb's precious coffee table, when I curled up next to him on Caleb's expensive couch, it felt like rebellion, like I was taking back some small piece of myself that had gotten lost in trying to be the perfect girlfriend for someone who was never going to think I was enough anyway. We weren't even doing anything that dramatic, just sitting close, enjoying each other's company. Finally feeling like myself again after months of walking on eggshells in my own supposed home. That's when I heard the sound that changed everything. The back door opening with Caleb's key. I swear my heart stopped beating for a second. Dante shot up from the couch so fast, he almost knocked me over. And there was Caleb standing in the doorway, looking like he'd seen a ghost. The whole scene was surreal. Me sitting there trying to figure out how to explain something that shouldn't have needed explaining. Dante looking between us like he'd been set up. Caleb asking who the hell this guy was, like he had any right to interrogate people in what was supposedly our shared home. When Caleb said he owned the house, I wanted to scream. Yes, technically it was his house, but I lived there too. I paid half the bills. I'd made it into a home. I'd invested 2 years of my life into building something with him. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was his name on the deed and my complete lack of legal protection. Dante left immediately. Of course, 23-year-old musicians don't stick around for relationship drama with homeowners. He just walked out the door like I was some random hookup instead of someone he'd been pursuing for weeks. That stung almost as much as Caleb's reaction. Because Caleb wasn't yelling or crying or acting like someone whose heart had just been broken. He was calm, cold, calculating, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment to prove some point he'd already made up his mind about. He told me I had to pack my things and leave immediately. Like I was some kind of intruder, instead of his girlfriend of 6 years who'd been living there for 2 years and paying half the expenses. I tried to explain that I'd been feeling lonely, that he'd been emotionally distant, that maybe if he'd been a better boyfriend, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere for connection. But he wasn't hearing any of it. He just kept talking about ownership and property, like our entire relationship could be reduced to whose name was on what document. When I brought up common law marriage, thinking maybe that would make him realize he couldn't just evict me after 6 years together, he had an answer ready for that too. Apparently, he'd already looked into it. Of course he had. Mr. Prepared had covered all his bases before he even caught me with Dante. This whole thing felt less like a spontaneous reaction to betrayal and more like the execution of a plan he'd been developing for months. The lockout was the final humiliation. Coming home after work the next day to find my key didn't work. Standing on the porch like an idiot, while neighbors peeked through their curtains at the drama. That's when I realized this wasn't some heat-of-the-moment decision he might regret later. This was calculated revenge from someone who'd been planning my exit strategy probably since the day we moved in together. In that moment, standing there, locked out of what I thought was my home, I understood that Caleb had never really seen me as his partner. I'd been a tenant with benefits, someone helping pay his mortgage while he waited to find his real future wife. And now that I'd given him the perfect excuse, he was cutting me loose without a second thought. The worst part was how easy it was for him. 6 years together, and he could just flip a switch and turn me into a stranger who wasn't welcome in his house anymore. That told me everything I needed to know about how much our relationship had actually meant to him. Real love doesn't come with an eviction notice. After the lockout, reality hit pretty fast. Dante stopped answering my calls within a week. Turns out, being young and unemployed doesn't exactly scream relationship material when things get complicated. I ended up crashing with Megan. But even she started making passive-aggressive comments about how I needed to figure things out and maybe take some responsibility for what happened. Easy for her to say, she wasn't the one who'd been made homeless by a vindictive ex-boyfriend who'd planned her downfall from day one. Everyone wanted to act like I was some kind of cheater who destroyed a perfect relationship. But nobody wanted to acknowledge that Caleb had been emotionally checked out for months before I ever talked to another guy. I tried everything to get him to have an adult conversation about what had happened. Long text messages explaining my perspective, emails about our history together and what we'd built. I even wrote him a handwritten letter. Took me hours to get the wording right. Sprayed it with that perfume he used to say he loved. But nothing worked. He'd just shut down completely. Like our entire relationship had never existed. Months went by, and I kept thinking he'd come to his senses. I'd drive by the house sometimes, just to see if anything had changed. That's when I saw he'd gotten a dog. Some rescue mutt. He was walking around the neighborhood like he was suddenly father of the year. He looked content. Happy even? Working out in his garage and playing fetch in the backyard that I tried to turn into a garden. The house that should have been ours was now just his. And he was thriving without me. New furniture, fresh paint. That herb garden I'd started was actually surviving under whatever care he was giving it now. It was like he'd taken everything we'd built together and made it better by removing me from the equation. When I finally worked up the courage to go to the door one last time, wearing his old hoodie, hoping to remind him of better times, he wouldn't even face me. Just talked through that intercom system like I was some kind of door-to-door salesperson he needed to get rid of. I stood there in the rain for 15 minutes, but he never opened the door. That's when I finally understood that Caleb hadn't just kicked me out. He'd erased me, like I was some temporary inconvenience in his carefully planned life that he was relieved to be done with. 18 months later, I'm still trying to rebuild my life, while Caleb has moved on completely. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he'd gotten some kind of advancement at work, started doing outdoor activities, and was seeing someone new. Of course she was, everything I'm not, quiet, outdoorsy, probably the type who thinks budgeting is romantic and finds his emotional unavailability mysterious instead of suffocating. I couldn't help myself. I looked her up online. She was pretty in that natural way some guys prefer, posting pictures of weekend activities and farmers market trips, like she'd never had an impulsive thought in her life. They looked happy together in a way that made my stomach turn. Really, genuinely happy. Like two people who'd found exactly what they were looking for. The house looked different in their photos too. Updated. Improved. That stupid herb garden flourishing under her care. It was like he'd taken the foundation we'd built together and used it to create something better with someone who actually appreciated his boring suburban dream. Meanwhile, I'm 30 now, sharing a cramped apartment with a roommate who leaves dirty dishes everywhere and thinks personal boundaries are suggestions. Still working the same job with no real prospects for advancement. Watching all my friends get married and buy houses while I'm starting over from scratch. Dante, he's married to some 22-year-old and playing coffee shop gigs on weekends. Everyone moved on except me. Everyone got their happy ending except the person who'd been loyal for 6 years and made one mistake when she was feeling neglected and unappreciated. But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. I don't regret what I did. Not really. Maybe I could have handled things differently. Maybe I should have just broken up with Caleb before getting involved with someone else. But the truth is, he was never going to be the partner I needed. He was too comfortable in his role as the responsible one. Too content with our boring routine to see that I was suffocating in his perfect little life. If he'd been more attentive, more emotionally available, more willing to compromise on his rigid vision of what our relationship should look like, maybe I wouldn't have been drawn to someone who actually made me feel alive again. The fact that he could just cut me out so completely after 6 years proves he never really loved me the way I deserve to be loved. Real love fights for what it has. Real love tries to understand and forgive. Real love doesn't come with backup plans and exit strategies. But Caleb had been planning my replacement from day one, just waiting for me to give him a reason to trade up to someone who would be more grateful for his financial stability and more willing to play the role of appreciative girlfriend. The house, the dog, the new girlfriend, it's all just proof that I was right about him. He never wanted a real partner who would challenge him or grow with him. He wanted an accessory for his suburban fantasy, someone who would make him look good and ask for nothing in return. And when I refused to shrink myself into that role, when I insisted on maintaining my own identity and needs, he showed me exactly how disposable I'd always been in his perfectly organized life. So now, I don't feel guilty about what happened. I feel sorry for his new girlfriend. Actually, she thinks she's won some prize. But all she's really done is sign up to be the supporting character in Caleb's boring, predictable story. And when she eventually realizes that his emotional availability hasn't improved, that his capacity for empathy and growth is still limited, that his love comes with conditions and fine print, maybe she'll understand why I had to look elsewhere for the connection he was never capable of providing. I may not have the house or the dog or the perfect suburban life, but at least I know who I am. At least I'm not pretending to be grateful for scraps of attention from someone who sees me as a burden instead of a blessing. At least I'm not settling for a relationship where I have to minimize myself to make someone else comfortable. And honestly, I'm better off without him.